And hello, everyone, and welcome to our second webinar on universal design for learning. Today, we're talking specifically about culturally responsive teaching and how that fits in with this idea of accessibility and universal design. So we're so excited that you're here. I'm going to turn off my camera so that you don't see me waving my hands the whole time, because I like to talk with my hands. And then we're going to go ahead and get started. So this is our agenda today. We're talking specifically about what culturally responsive teaching is. We're going to talk about why we use it. We're going to give you a framework for this. And then we're going to talk about some misconceptions of it, about what culturally responsive teaching is not. So we're excited that you are here today and hope that we can answer some of these questions. As we go through, if you do have any questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A tool at the bottom or the top, wherever your Zoom tools are. Use the Q&A tool to submit any questions. We'll be able to answer them either by texting, by writing an answer in, or we will answer them live. So we want you to feel free to ask any questions that you need. So let's get started. What is culturally responsive teaching? Well, the first thing that we have to recognize is that culturally responsive teaching is a pedagogy. It recognizes the importance of including students' cultural references in all aspects of learning. And that's the idea of culturally responsive teaching, is that we are making room for anyone's culture to be represented there inside of that learning environment. We also recognize that culturally responsive teaching is a process. It focuses on the role of communication and how we receive information. It shapes the thinking processes of groups and individuals and celebrates differences in cultural learning. See, we recognize that every student that comes into our room or comes into our class or comes in, however we are having that interaction, they come with a specific and unique cultural background. And so we want to make sure that in our culturally responsive teaching, that we are focusing on our communication and how our students are receiving the content and information from our class so that we can be responsive to that and celebrate our differences in that way. This is a great quote that really kind of provides some great parameters around it. Culturally responsive teaching is defined as using the cultural characteristics, experiences, and perspectives of ethnically diverse students as conduits for teaching them more effectively. So that's really the heart of what culturally responsive teaching is. It's about making sure that our students' cultural characteristics and perspectives are harnessed and used for better and more effective teaching, because not every student learns in the exact same way. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass it over to Paige, who's going to tell us about why we use culturally responsive teaching.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So on the next slide, you're going to see everyone has a culture. So culturally responsive teaching leverages the brain's memory system. So we have many diverse students who come from many different kinds of cultures and cultural traditions. Many of them are oral traditions. This means their primary way of knowledge transfer and making meaning is oral, and it is active. So if we're looking at these two things, we can see that culture includes many different things. And also we see the influences and how we can think about them when we are building content and when we are providing instruction to the students. So next slide. So Zaretta Hammond has a book called Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. If you have a chance, you might want to take a look at this, but one of the quotes that we thought was very important was, "The problem of the achievement gap won't be solved by simply trying to motivate students of color to become more engaged learners. We have to create school environments that welcome their natural ways of learning and shape that content so that we can see its connection to their lives and funds of knowledge." So next slide. Here we go. So why we use it. So when we're looking at it and we're thinking about recognizing, we need to understand that these diverse learners need to feel seen by the instructors. So what does that mean? That means that we need to make sure that we have taken some time in order to build bonds with students and build that trust so that students know that if they don't understand something and they need to be able to come up and know that you're going to help them, and maybe you're going to change something in order for them to either learn it faster or provide you the assessment in a different manner that still shows that they have mastered the objective. So building that trust helps those students to feel seen. So responding to those students by noticing them and using their name, it also really helps affirm those students so that they understand that you are there to help them by always using their name, pronouncing it correctly, and those things are necessary because that helps that bond of trust take shape. So the brain, using cultural tools for processing information using the brain's memory system. So when we're thinking about students who come from those oral cultural traditions, this means that they're very used to speaking both oral and receiving information that way as oral, hearing it. So it's very common in cultural groups across Southeastern Asia, African American, Latino, Pacific Islander. They all have very strong oral traditions and cultures. Each of these cultural groups uses the brain's memory system for turning information into usable knowledge. They use memory strategies to make learning stick, like connecting what needs to be remembered to rhythm or music, which is why we still know the ABC song. And I'm sure if I start this next song, which I'm going to do for you very briefly, you're going to be able to finish it. Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, and you can finish all 50 states in alphabetical order if you learned 50 Nifty United States. Why? And you haven't probably sung that in probably 20 years. But if you ever learned it, and when I started that, I know that now that's going to be stuck in your head for the rest of the afternoon. I apologize. But I want you to understand that those are things that really help use that brain's memory system. So thinking about ways to do that, you could always make it fun, like a song, a riddle, a limerick. You could ask the students to create their own and share them. There may be other students who would find value and be very helpful as study guides or studying or learning any kind of content. So when we're thinking about doing any of the things, we're not saying change, we're thinking about adding the +1. So thinking about adding that +1 when you're creating content, you may want to add a video in addition to a page of text, so that you have both of those ways to help students who may prefer, or maybe that's their natural way of learning, is in an oral tradition. So you may have a PDF of content as well. It may be a text, it may be a PDF. So again, you might want to make sure that you think about all of the things that you have, and then you think about adding that +1. And when we're teaching, we want to try to mirror the same of those students are learning. So when you're walking through your information, you provide that written form plus the +1. So thinking about communalism, so understanding the worldview of interdependence rather than in our culture, we think of more of independent. So students coming from different cultures may rely heavily on each other for their learning. So we have to think about building in things that allow that collaboration to happen, and still allow students to own the knowledge that you are providing to them. Connections. So you're going to want to try to connect with those students and build that trust in order for them to share with you things that you may not have thought about, or different ways of approaching information, both delivery of the content and delivery or receiving an assessment. So you need to think about how students are receiving that information, and by building the trust, that you have that opportunity to ask them for their feedback or their preferences, or what they liked and what they didn't like at the end, and then taking that information in order to build your future courses, as well as continually refine the ones that you're currently teaching. So to become culturally responsive, the recommends the following things. So understanding that culture has a role in education. So actively learning about students' cultures and communities, learning about beliefs and values of a variety of cultures, whether or not those cultures are even represented in the class. And then also taking your knowledge of those different cultures and bringing it into the classroom to bring awareness into all of the students who are in your room about other cultures and ways of learning that are going on. So I'm going to turn this back over to Wesley for the Ready for Rigor portion.
Yeah, so the Ready for Rigor is a framework that we can use to talk about and discuss how to be culturally responsive. So these are just some tools that we can use in our classrooms and our online spaces to make sure that we are actually implementing this type of culturally responsive teaching. And so there are four things that build this framework. The first is awareness. We have to understand what culture means. We have to understand our own culture, and we have to understand our own beliefs and biases and how that is affecting our teaching and how that's affecting our courses. And we have to understand how the brain learns through culture. Just like Paige demonstrated, and I'm so glad that she sang the song and not me, was when we learn things in certain ways, dependent on our culture, they tend to stick with us in those same ways. And so understanding how culture and learning are meshed together. Another way of thinking that is also understanding our information processing, that our brains process information through specific strategies. And some of those can be common to oral cultures, and some of them can be common to oral cultures or text-based cultures. It just kind of depends on our culture and how we were taught to learn. And so if we understand some brain-based information processing strategies from different cultural backgrounds, then we're going to be able to pivot, and we're going to be able to use those strategies in our courses to really develop that type of skills, those types of skills in our students, to meet them where they are and to encourage them to be in the space that we're in with that course. We want to develop learning partnerships. We have diverse learners that need to be in partnership with instructors and build trust. I don't know how many of you were in our first session. I'd encourage you, if you didn't come to that, to go back and watch the recording. It's available on our website. But in that session, we talked about how we want to view our students as learners instead of students, because in the Universal Design for Learning framework, students are assessed by instructors, and the goal is that we are actually helping our students assess themselves, and they become learners. Learners assess themselves, students are assessed by instructors. And so we view this learning experience as a partnership where instructors and students and learners are partners, and we build trust across cultural barriers. And then we start to build community. So we develop welcoming and supportive environments that are emotionally and socially safe for these students. The ways that we can do that is, one, creating that type of community in in the atmosphere of our class with our students, where we're building out those social presences between our students. But it's also maybe thinking about the different types of systems that our students are a part of, connecting them to other types of supportive environments and resources that they may need to feel emotionally and socially safe inside of our classroom. And so this framework helps us understand how we can take any lesson, how we can take any moment of instruction and really respond to it in a culturally responsive way. So we have 3 tips to help make any lesson culturally responsive. It kind of taps into all the different types of things, all the different types of cultures our students may experience, and it really helps us really dive in to this idea of how we can be culturally responsive. So the first is that we can gamify it. Now, gamification is one of those buzzwords in education. So lots of people think that gamification means that I'm taking my whole course and I'm completely redesigning it from the ground up with points and using these different softwares and doing these different things. So all of that may be true, and that's part of gamification, but it's not necessarily how all that gamification is. Gamifying is where we just use games to reinforce different types of cultural learning. For example, a lot of games employ cultural tools that you'd find in oral traditions, like repetition, solving puzzles, making connections between things that don't seem to be related. And when we can harness those types of skills and use them in our courses, whether that be through discussion boards, whether that be through including some type of game that students can play, or redesigning some units to do that, there are multiple ways that we can approach gamification, even if it's just in one lesson, but that can allow that lesson to become just a little bit more culturally responsive. An easy thing to do is to start making learning more social based. So instead of it becoming a lecture where it's a one-way interaction, it becomes a 2 or 3-way interaction where students are responding back with the instructor and students are responding to each other. This is where we organize our learning so that students rely on each other, and it builds diverse students' communal orientation. That's one of the main indicators of success in an online classroom, is where students are able to have a social presence where they can connect with each other and can build on the learning of each other. Sometimes that is not easily done. Though there are easy tools to do it, that requires a lot of work to build that type of community in our classes. It's not just throwing a discussion board into a module, but it's taking the time to provide space for our students to come to know each other, to provide, opportunities for our students to connect, whether that's through synchronous Zoom sessions or whether that's through things like Google Chat or kind of those side channels of communication, or whether it's through discussion boards and group projects and peer feedback. There are lots of different ways that we can make our courses social, but by starting to increase that social learning aspect, we start tapping into diverse cultural needs and information processing powers. We can also storify it. Now, this is easy for me coming from a humanities kind of background with English and communication. We tell stories about everything. You can't make us stop. But one thing that we can really harness is if we can take our content and connect it to a story, it helps diverse students really learn that content more effectively. It creates a narrative structure about the topic, and as that process is presented, the brain is able to weave it all together a little bit more coherently than viewing it as separate topics. This is what makes trainings that kind of tell the story where you follow one particular individual through kind of the journey. It's what makes those more impactful. It's what makes them stick with us longer, because we're able to relate to the story a lot more than we're able to relate to individual concepts. This is also true for students that come from more oral and oral backgrounds, especially culturally, because what it allows is it allows them to connect to that story, and through that story, remember the content. So they may not remember that 2 plus 2 always equals 4, but they can remember about the little boy who went to market and he had 2 apples from one stall and 2 apples from another, and how many did he end up with? So it's just a very base example, but it shows us the power of what stories can do inside of culturally responsive teaching scenarios. There's some other things that we can do that we just kind of pulled together to help reinforce that cultural responsiveness. The first is to incorporate reflection into the learning unit. When we take each unit and each topic and we start providing a moment to reflect, What we're actually doing is helping our students transfer information from short-term memory to long-term memory. That's what reflection does. It helps them move that information out of that I just crammed all of this into my head so that I can answer this quiz into, okay, I can remember this in a couple of months, or I can remember this in a couple of years. One way that you can do that, one strategy is called the minute paper. It doesn't necessarily have to be a paper per se, but it's, you give your students, 60 seconds, 2 minutes, however many minutes, that's not very long, and you just ask them to reflect on what they've just learned. Put this in your own words, put your own culture and your own strategy and your own frame around this to really help drive the points home. This could be done as kind of an end of semester or end of unit module discussion board. It could be done as just an assignment where students submit it. It could even be done in one of those other back channels, whether that's a Google chat or whether that's asking students to respond to an announcement of their own response. There are tons of ways you can incorporate this that don't have to equal a grade in the grade book, but it provides a reflective moment for students. We can also support our students in writing assignments by providing detailed instructions and rubrics. You're going to hear that a lot as we talk about universal design, because those are the types of things, pardon the dog in the background, those are the types of things that allow our students to really connect and understand their expectations. Another piece that would be really helpful, especially for students from multiple cultural backgrounds, is providing a multitude of examples. If we can provide multiple examples of what is happening in that assignment, if we can provide multiple examples showing students what they should be doing, then that helps them connect it to what they're trying to do. And so they can get through maybe the text, and maybe you can provide a verbal response or a video walking through the assignment and providing an example that can help those students. You can also use things like rough drafts or rough draft, final draft structures to ensure students are understanding the material. I've always been a proponent of providing rough drafts for hard concepts or for hard exams or hard assignments and topics and objectives, because I want to make sure that they understand it. And if all I'm getting is the final draft, then I never had the opportunity to provide the robust feedback they need to be successful in the end. And so using a rough draft, final draft structure can help do that. We can also provide skeletal notes for lectures so students can follow along. So instead of just assuming that our students know how to take notes or assuming that our students are able to process the information from a classroom, we can provide them guides to help them. And this is especially true for students that maybe don't come from oral backgrounds and oral cultures, because maybe they're not used to understanding what people say. And so they need something that they can write or something that they can see to help connect those dots. You can also do the preview, summarize information in teaching sessions so students can make connections. So one strategy to do this is the where we've been, where we are, where we're going strategy. And what that is basically in an announcement video, you can say, last week we talked about this, that's where we were. This week we're talking about this, so that next week we can do that. That's where we're going. And what that allows is it allows the students, the learners, to take what's happening in that class and really apply it to that narrative structure of past, present, future, and helps them understand the trajectory and the movement through the class. So these are some examples of just some practices that culturally responsive teaching can do, especially using that Ready for Rigor framework. So before we kind of wrap up today, we want to take some time and share with you what some misconceptions are. So I'm going to share that. I'm going to pass that back to Paige. Maybe.
Wesley, I think she may have locked. Yeah, she can't unmute at the moment.
Okay, no worries. Then we will keep trucking. So let's talk about some misconceptions with culturally responsive teaching. What is it not? Culturally responsive teaching is one misconception, is that culturally responsive teaching is the same as multicultural or social justice education. And that is not true. Multicultural education is, according to Zaretta Hammond, the celebration of diversity, what we usually see in schools. Whereas social justice education is about building a lens for the students, really being able to look at the world and seeing where things aren't fair or where injustice exists. So culturally responsive teaching is not the same as those two concepts. Rather, culturally responsive teaching is where we are helping our students understand through their cultural lenses the content that we're presenting. So it's not necessarily the types of things that happen in multicultural or social justice education. Another one is that culturally responsive teaching must start with addressing implicit bias. That's not necessarily true. It doesn't necessarily start with addressing implicit bias. That can be helpful, but it's not necessary. Rather, culturally responsive teaching needs to start with an awareness of culture, not necessarily our bias in cultures, but what our cultures are. That's where it starts. Culturally responsive teaching is all about building relationships and self-esteem. That's also incorrect. Culturally responsive teaching actually lands more on the cognitive side of learning than the affective social, the self-esteem relationship side. It lands more on the cognitive side. It's the brain and how the brain processes information and how our cultures influence how we process that information. So culturally responsive teaching is really about helping our students use their brains to do what we're asking them to do. It's helping our students use the tools they already have, that they've already been given by their culture, so that they can move forward with what is happening next. Finally, the final misconception is that culturally responsive teaching is about choosing the right strategies. That's incorrect as well. Culturally responsive teaching is about building the learning capacity of the individual student. That's another quote from Zaretta Hammond. It's not about choosing the right strategies or picking the right things from the right textbooks, from the right motivational speakers. It's culturally responsive teaching is about helping our students connect with their learning through their cultural backgrounds. Here's a handy chart that kind of shows you these three things all together. You've got that multicultural education, that social justice education, and that culturally responsive education, all kind of blending here together. And if you notice on the far right, where the culturally responsive education column is, it says that, this type of teaching focuses on improving the learning capacity of diverse students who've been marginalized educationally. So yes, there is some celebration of diversity. And yes, we are talking with some social politics because we're talking about marginalization, but we're focusing on their learning and the learning capacity of those students. Also, culturally responsive teaching centers around the affective and cognitive aspects of teaching and learning, and its efforts to accelerate learning live here. So it's about the learning. It's not necessarily about the systems that have affected that student prior to that learning. It's about how can we harness their culture to help them learn better. And then it concerns itself with building cognitive capacity and academic mindset by pushing back on dominant narratives about people of color. That's one of the main things that culturally responsive teaching does. It recognizes that different cultures learn different ways, and not one culture is better than the other. So rather than just saying, rather than dismissing cultures and rather than saying you have to learn it this way, culturally responsive teaching opens the doors so that diverse cultures can learn the same content in similar ways that are best for their particular cultural backgrounds. So that is a whole lot of information about culturally responsive teaching. And I hope that we've done it justice today. I hope that you can walk away today understanding what culturally responsive teaching is, and maybe have just a couple of ideas that you can use in your classrooms and in your learning environments to really implement culturally responsive teaching starting tomorrow. So what now? What do we do next? We go back to the module from the first session. If you weren't here at our first session, that is okay. We just asked people to pick a module in their course, a learning unit, something small that we could start kind of playing with as we walk through these concepts of universal design. So we want you to ask a couple of questions. What's one shift that, does that module have any evidence of culturally responsive teaching? Have you provided space for students from diverse cultures to harness that information? And if not, what's one thing? What's that +1 that you can do in that module? Can you gamify something? Can you add some moments of socialization? Can you storify something? Can you provide moments of reflection? Or can you provide better expectations and rubrics? What are some things that you can do to harness some different cultural aspects in that particular module? And then we're going to ask you to implement that shift. So, Paige, it looks like you're unmuted. Is there anything that you want to add from anything we've talked about?
I'm not unmuted.
You are.
Nope, not on my screen.
Oh, well, you are muted in the webinar. We can hear you.
Oh, well, super. No. Nope. Sorry.
Okay. No, you're
I
good.
can't do anything. So I'm
Okay, you're good. So I know we have one comment come in from the chat, and if you have any other questions, please add them to the Q&A. We can take questions. Is there any research on if students prefer audio or video? I've been adding audio to my weekly announcements with the written, but not video of me instructor. There seems to be listening. They seem to be listening by their comments. I will say that there is probably research. I'm not going to lie and say I've done it, but I can do a quick Google Scholar search, that there is research that supports the use of audio video announcements. So there's research that shows both. I don't know if there's been one that says video is better than audio. I know that typically on a spectrum, students prefer video over audio because it increases instructor presence. But I also know that some students prefer the audio over the video because they can play the audio while maybe they're on a commute or they're driving. And so they can listen, but they don't have to watch anything. And so it just, I think that's one of those things that's dependent on our students. But any type of moment that we can use audio or video to communicate is going to be more effective for our students because our voices, that nonverbal communication that comes through is going to be important, as well as helping our students from diverse cultural backgrounds access that information. So that's part of it too, for sure. Does anyone else have any questions or anything before we wrap it up today? Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for being here today. I know we ran a little bit short of the hour, but the next one's going to take the full hour, I assure you, when we go through nuts and bolts of accessibility. Just so that you are aware, all of our sessions are going to be added to our IIT site. We have a Google site where we're adding these kinds of things. And if you wait half a minute, I will provide that link in the chat so that you can go take a look at it and see what is best for you. We actually have a whole new page for Universal Design for Learning so that you can get all of those pieces that you need. So I'll add that to the chat so you can go watch the first one, and then we can go from there. Our next webinar is going to be in November, and I have to go to my calendar to find it. Thanks. On that. It's going to be on November 16th. At this same time at 2:30 in the afternoon. So November 16th, 2:30 in the afternoon will be our final session. And that's the session that we're really going to focus on the nuts and bolts of accessibility as part of Universal Design for Learning. So it's going to be more specifically focused on how we can use accessibility tools inside of Canvas to make sure that our courses are accessible. All right. If you don't have any other questions, we hope to see you on the 16th. And we hope to hear about your fun stories of implementing universal design in your courses.